Hi, I'm Emily from Trident Fly Fishing, and today we're going to tie the Gray Ghost Streamer, perhaps one of the most famous streamer patterns of all time. It's a classic New England streamer pattern and was created in the early 1920s by Carrie Stevens from the Rangeley Lakes region of Maine. The fly is tied to imitate a smelt, a common forage fish for the giant legendary brook trout of the Rangeley Lakes region where Carrie Stevens lived. The story goes that when Carrie Stevens first tested her initial Gray Ghost streamer pattern in the upper dam pool, she very quickly reeled in a 6-pound brook trout, proving the effectiveness of this fly. There's a lot of variation in how people tie this fly today, but we're going to tie it in the traditional Featherwing streamer pattern today. We're actually going to use 3 different colors of thread today. The white is for the light underbody and the working thread. We'll switch to black when we tie in the wing, and then the red is a finishing accent for the head in classic Carrie Stevens style. Moving to the body, there's an orange floss body, and we're going to be using a 4-strand rayon floss today. Typically, you're going to see it in a light orange as opposed to the darker, more pumpkin-colored orange, but there is variation, and we'll stick with the traditional color in the lighter orange for today. There's a silver tinsel tag on this fly, as well as a silver tinsel rib. We're using mylar tinsel. I like the extra small, regardless of the size of the fly. I think this gives you a cleaner finish. The materials in the throat of the fly start with Peacock Herl. Then we have a golden pheasant crest, and there's white bucktail, very sparse in the belly of the fly as well. The wing is 4 saddle hackles in gray, olive gray, as it's described in the original recipe. And then the shoulder of the fly is this silver pheasant on each side. There's also a jungle cock cheek, which is a beautiful addition to the fly and finishes off the traditional pattern, but unfortunately I don't have that today. This is a white thread body, and that's important in the underbody because when the fly gets wet with a light colored floss, it would discolor the floss a bit if you had a dark black thread underneath. The next ingredient is the tag on the fly. It's a silver mylar tinsel. I'm going to use so that I tie it in so that the silver side is facing out on the tag. I'm holding the silver facing me, bringing it up against the thread and tight to the hook shank. That way I can pull this back and get it positioned perfectly in place. I tied it in just ahead of the hook point so that when I wrap back over the tinsel to secure it, I end up right about halfway between the barb and the point to start wrapping the tag. Now I like to use this vise inverted when I wrap in the tag, because it gets the hook point out of the way and it gets my bobbin out of the way. This is a non-true rotary vise, so it takes the hook out of plane, but it puts it in a perfect position for me to wrap this tag as we're doing right now. And this is double wrapped, so I've wrapped backwards, and now I'm wrapping back over those first set of wraps forward to the tie-in point. And just a couple turns of the thread will secure that in position. Now this is also the ingredient for my ribbing on the fly, and since this fly does not have a tail, that would be the next ingredient that I would tie in. But since I'm right here, I'm just going to wrap back, and rather than cut it and tie it in again, just going to have it ready to go, secured, while I tie in the body. We're using a light orange floss for the body. Sometimes you'll see this fly tied with a darker, almost pumpkin colored orange, but as far as we can tell, this is the closest shade of orange to the original fly. This is a 4-strand floss, and given the size of this fly, I'm going to use all 4 strands. When I tie it in, I'm going to leave a long tag end, as you can see here, along that hook shank. The reason for that is because I'm going to use the floss in my underbody. I'm going to incorporate this as I wrap the thread back forward to the head. and kind of tame it with a little bit by wetting it a little bit. Now with floss-bodied flies, you really need, the key is to get a nice, smooth, uniform underbody. And this what I'm doing right now is a technique that I learned from my uncle, and I'm not nearly as adept at it as he is, but he calls it the balanced thread wrap. And the key is I'm applying tension in the thread as I come around the hook until I engage with the material, that floss, and then I reduce my tension as I come loop and over the floss, and then tighten up as I get opposite the material again. And what that's doing is preventing the floss from traveling around the shank, which it's sort of trying to do right now in the tag end here. But you'll see when we get to the head here, it gives me a nice, uniform, smooth body. Now don't crowd the eye too much. You want to leave yourself plenty of room because we do have quite a few materials at the front of the fly to tie in. I'm going to leave my thread at the front and get ready to wrap my floss. With the 4 strands, you want them to lay nice and flat, so use your fingers to stroke the floss so that it flattens out and keeps the fibers from separating. And I'm going to wrap very uniformly from back to front. I'm overlapping each wrap by 1/2 to 2/3, and my wraps are laying very evenly against one another. And I have a slight angle in the floss as I'm moving forward, but not by much, because we do want to maintain that overlap. The key here is you're just looking for as smooth and uniform a thread body as you can achieve. And you can see my floss is starting to separate a little bit, but it will still look fine in the end. You'll see, especially up near the head of the fly, we have so many materials to tie in the throat and the wing, that the front third, really, of the body is going to become obscured once we get everything finished. And just a couple wraps to secure that, and I'm going to snip off the floss. At this point, I'm going to switch over to my black thread. This is also a really good time to throw in a whip finish, because if you lose that, just a 2-turn whip finish is enough. If you lose that end of floss that you just tied in, you're back to square one. You can't rewrap that floss once it's been cut. So now we're switching over to the black finishing thread. This is a Danville 6/0. All right, in position, ready to wrap that rib forward. We want a silver tinsel rib. Even spacing with your ribbing. The key is using this extra small tinsel. It gives a much cleaner look. You can see I have, I'm on wrap number 5, so that puts me right about in the middle of the shank, which is about perfect. It's going to give me 10 or 12 wraps for the whole fly. If you put them too close, it just looks too crowded, and if they're too wide, then it's also not the traditional look. It takes a little practice, but I've always said the key is using that extra small tinsel, even for the bigger flies. Really gives it a much cleaner look. So there's the completed body of the fly. Now we're ready to begin to tie in the throat. And the first ingredient is Peacock Herl. And you can use strung Herl, but I really prefer to use the Herl right off the feather because it's less likely to have damaged tips. And since this is a streamer pattern and you're not wrapping the Herl, you really want to have that nice clean tip. So I need 4 or 5 strands. Again, looking for those nice clean tips. Probably cut a few from each side of the feather, just to even things out. Now I want to even up these tips, so it's a matter of just... The recipe says the Peacock herl should extend just beyond the barb. So I'm going to get my measurement here. Looks good. Pinch with my thumb and middle finger. I'm going to go loose collecting wrap here, and then tension as I pull up on the materials. It only takes 2 or 3 wraps to secure. We'll trim off those tag ends. Next, there's white bucktail. This is very sparse, and we're going to cut just a small clump of fibers from the middle of the tail and then stack it in a hair stacker. We'll pull out those short, odd length fibers and put them in tips first, of course, into that hair stacker. Doesn't matter if you lose a few, we'll probably pull some out anyway. It needs to be nice and sparse. There, that looks good. Now I'll hold loosely about partway down and pull out those shorter butt ends. That's still a little bit heavy. We want it to be pretty sparse. So I'm going to cut some of that, take some of that out. There we go. The length should be exactly the same as your Peacock herl. So hold it straight up against the herl. Again, thumb and middle finger, loose collecting wrap, and then apply even tension. 2 to 3 to secure. And at this point, you can use your fingers to kind of move the material so that it's exactly in the center of the hook. You can look at it from a couple different angles, make sure you like the way it's laying. Then I'll actually throw in a whip finish right here, just a couple turns, since I have it's a good time to make sure that your materials are all secured before we add the final ingredient in the throat, which is a golden pheasant crest. Now this is just a section of a golden pheasant. It has the full feathers as well as the crest feathers, which are these yellow curved feathers. And the length of the feather is supposed to be shorter than the rest of the throat and curving upward. So we're going to select the feather as we normally would, strip off the fluff at the end there. Measure your feather. Now if I tie it in as it is, it's pushing up into the, there we go, that's what we want. We're just looking for that angle where the feather will curve upwards, but not push into the materials too much. So when I find that point, I'll hold in a pinch and a couple turns to secure. And again, I had a little bit of movement on these materials, so I'm going to use my fingers to bring them back underneath the hook shank. That golden pheasant looks good the way it is right there. So we'll trim off that end. And at this point, I'm going to pause and I'm going to use a small drop of head cement and let it penetrate down through those wraps and underneath to hold those throat materials securely in place. There's the bottom part of the fly. Before we tie in the feather wing itself, we're going to add a golden pheasant crest, curving downward. This is an accent in the wing. So I've taken a nice crest with nice long fibers, uniform curve here, and we'll do a nice pinch wrap to secure. check my position. It's a little bit off center, so you can usually adjust it pretty well with your fingers. That looks good. Now it's time to attach the wing of the fly. The recipe calls for olive gray saddle hackle. Now this is perhaps a lighter gray than you might see sometimes, but it's a good color for the smelt imitation that this fly is supposed to be. Now you can buy strung saddle, which is what this is, and you'll have varying types of feathers, varying quality in the feathers when you buy them strung like this. So what you're really looking for, and I've picked my feathers ahead of time, what you're really looking for is a profile very much like this feather, where you have a wide base and then not too pointy, but nice and full webbing out towards the end. We want 4 feathers that are similar in shape. And if you have a less than perfect feather, you can put that on the inside, because you'll see I need 2 feathers for each side of the wing. I'll lay them on my hand and line up those tips. That's the key. See how I'm lining the tips up? And I do 1 wing at a time. One half at a time. Once I have them pretty well lined up, I'm just going to cut off the extra butt ends. Here's the second half of the fly. Again, line up the tips and trim. Now for the length, you'll see a lot of variation here. Now let's get all our feathers first. Jump ahead. We want the top of the feather to be facing out, just as it would be if it was on the bird. So I'm matching those two halves. Now I have my wing, my 4 matched feathers, matched pairs. Now that would be much too long of a wing, so we need to estimate the size, bring it back a little bit. I like to tie my wing in so that it's just extending just beyond the bend of the hook. Again, you will see some variability in that, but the more traditional way, just beyond the bend. So once I have that estimated tie-in point, I'm going to get rid of some of these extra fibers. There, just exposing those butt ends, so you're exposing the stem of the feathers. Pinch just behind the butt ends to expose the stem of each of the 4 feathers. And let's a nice loose collecting wrap to make sure we have all the materials, and then apply tension evenly as we come down. I usually do 2 to 3 wraps and then check the position of my wing. Looks pretty good, but I'm going to back off and reset it one more time. If you have any adjustments that you need to make, it's better to do it right away before you get too far along with finishing the head, because you can always go back and reset your materials at that time. All right, that looks pretty good. Now, I'm not going to worry about cutting those butt ends because we're going to be covering them up with the cheek. And actually, we got a good even coverage just by wrapping over with the thread. All right, we're almost there. The cheek on this fly, or the shoulder, excuse me, more accurately called the shoulder, is silver pheasant. Now, these are typically how you'll see silver pheasant feathers for sale, and a small piece off of the bird. Sometimes you'll just buy it in individual feathers, but I like to buy it I like to get it as part of the whole section of the shoulder. I'm going to pick 2 feathers of approximately equal size. And got a few more than I needed there. And sizing needs to be about 1/3 the length of that wing. Perfect. So I'm going to size 1 like so. And then I'll take my second feather, lay it on top, and use the first that I already stripped to make them identical in size. You want them just within a few barbs of each other to be about the same. Cut off those butt ends. Now I tie in one cheek at a time. I usually start on the back, but just personal preference. You want the barb or the shank of that feather to be even with the parallel to the hook shank. Just a couple wraps is all it takes. Make sure you like the angle. That's better. And number 2. See how you can tweak it pretty easily before you put those finishing wraps on, so it is good to sit back and make sure you like the position of each ingredient as you tie them in. Trim those ends. And we're ready to finish the head here. So we should have a final ingredient, jungle cock eye, as the cheek on this fly. But since we don't have that, we're gonna call this fly just about complete. I'm finishing the head, just smoothing out my black thread. Now I'm going to do a whip finish, but you'll notice I like to flatten my thread out first. So it just means counterclockwise spinning of the thread to flatten it out. This gives us a much smoother head. And you can give the head a nice taper as you do your whip finish. And one final finishing touch. And this was a Carrie Stevens original, so I certainly can't take credit for this. She liked to do an accent of a contrasting thread color in the middle of the eye at the end. And with the Gray Ghost, that was red. So we just add a couple wraps, and then, as we would with a regular finishing on the head, there's a whip finish. And snip. And then we finish the fly with the head cement. And I'll go back and do a couple different layers of head cement as each layer dries. But that is a pretty nice rendition of the Featherwing Gray Ghost Streamer.